Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into another educational video here on the HeroesHearth YouTube. My name is Bahamut, joined by Justing, and we've already looked at tanks, so let's jump into another role. Let's get into our off-lane tier list, and of course, Justing here has already built a tier list for all of you at home. Justing, are you ready to blow everyone's minds on the rankings for all of these offlaners?
Yep, I'm ready to get into it, and I'd like to show some of the priorities here in the off lane, as there could be, in the tier 1 heroes, there could be some things that people expect, but I think the lower down the list you get, in the middle area, there's some things that might catch you off guard a bit.
And we're actually going to be starting this out a little bit different. Last time we went from tier 1 downward. Let's go the other way around this time. We're going to be starting at tier 5. We've got Arthas, Gazlowe, Murky, Thrall, Zagara, Artanis, and Illidan in this tier 5. Can you break down why these heroes are in tier 5 and why you're wrong to put Murky here?
So the reason that these heroes are in tier 5 is they're very, very niche heroes that have very specific use cases. Arthas, Artanis, and Thrall, for example, can only really be played on Battlefield of Eternity or Braxis because they don't have the wave clear that a traditional offlaner needs on most maps. So you need to play it on a 2-lane map. Something like Illidan, for example, is only really pickable as a specific counter to something else, not so much, or for a specific playstyle. Same with Murky. It's not so much for the 1v1 because they do lose most 1v1s. It's more for, say you want to play a hunt combo on a big map for the global, or say you want to have a Murky just proxying and have an octo grab with a Phoenix laser across the map or something like that. Like, unless you have a specific strategy, there isn't a real good reason to pick these heroes in the offlane, and that's why they're in tier 5. But they are still offlaners, and they are still pickable in certain situations.
Yeah, we'll call these the really highlighting that very situational moment there for tier 5s. But moving up on our list, jumping into tier 4, we've got a Brightwing, D.Va, Chen, Muradin, Rexxar, and Ariel. We got a few heroes here, you know, a tank, we got a healer, we got a couple healers. Can you break down what is tier 4? Because it kind of seems like a bit of an amalgam. It's a mixture of everything.
Yeah, so there's, I guess, different categories here within tier 4. You have the Rexxar, D.Va, Chen, which are kind of more the traditional bruiser offlane that you expect to see in the offlane. They all kind of fill the same role. It's more kind of down to player preference. We've seen Chen and Rexxar specifically getting picked just based off of player preference in the CCL, especially, where maybe the Chen's not quite as strong as the Blaze, but they still want to pick it because they have, you know, a little bit more comfort with it, or they think that they'll get more value out of it with the barrel, for example. Or Rexxar with that level 20 Boar upgrade. Mm-hmm. So they're kind of the same as the higher tier ones, but they're not things that you would want to necessarily pick really early on, like you can with the other just tanky bruiser tier 1 offlaners. So they're kind of the same. They do the same thing, but they're just not, they're a little bit more situational. And Muradin is more specifically a counter pick to some of the offlaners that rely on sustain or just shields, like Chen, for example. You can take the Stormbolt quest level 1 and just get tons of stacks by just constantly hitting them in the off lane, and level 4 you get the sledgehammer. So I think Muradin is actually a really underrated offlaner that you don't see very much, but he does have his use cases, especially on 2-lane maps. And Brightwing, Oriel are in this tier because if you want to draft double support on a lot of maps, the main issue that you tend to fall into is how you play the actual map, how you play the macro. And Oriel and Brightwing can both hold their own in a lane. They both have relatively good wave clear, and they can kind of just stand their ground in a 1v1 against any of the meta offlaners. So while they're not the best option for the offlane, they do allow your draft to be flexible. So that's why Brightwing and Oriel are in tier 4 for an offlane.
And tier 4 does have this really nice sort of dichotomy of kind of 3 different areas as you broke it down. You have your bruiser, your traditional offlane per se. You've got this mixture in Muradin, and then you have your couple supports as well that can kind of be in that solo lane for maybe a double support composition. Jumping up into tier 3, we're going to be looking at some more traditional offlaners. Things are starting to look a little bit more like what people are expecting here, with Azul, Ragnaros, Maiev, Sonya, Malthael, Zeratul, Gul'dan, and Orphea. Can you kind of break down how this tier works? Because I feel like a lot of these heroes wave clear really good, but some of their team fighting can be a little lackluster at times.
Yeah, so these heroes are all heroes that are heavily enabled by double support, and heavily they're kind of a category of heroes that I've talked about, heroes like goalies that you can't siege into, like Junkrats and Chromies. This category mainly has heroes that I consider what I categorize as, I call them demons, and they're things that you enable in double support because basically they stat check the enemy. If they have enough healing and they have enough support behind them, you kind of either have enough damage to kill them or you can't. Examples of that are like the Malthael in this category, where if you had a Medivh comp, for example, a Malthael would be a really strong offlaner. Or Sonya kind of does the same thing with Wrath, where she does a ton of damage, but she also does a ton of healing. So if there's a Zarya or there's a Medivh, if there's a lot of support for her, you just are unable to kill her if you don't have the damage output. So this category is mostly double support, double soak offlaners. So it's kind of different from the traditional just 1v1 sort of you're fighting over the wave. They just want to get tempo, like the Zul or the Ragnaros or the Maiev. Those three are really just trying to double soak as quickly as possible. They're an offlaner in the sense that they are in that position, but they're really just bouncing between the two lanes as fast as possible, trying to clear as quickly as they can and get kind of tempo over the other offlane. The Sonya and Malthael and Zeratul are kind of that demon that I talked about. Their goal is to just kind of scale into the late game and do camps and be sort of a secondary hyper carry for the team later on. But they don't do the best in the 1v1, and they're a little bit more unsafe to ganks, which is why they're in tier 3. And Gul'dan and Orphea are in here because out of all the ranged heroes, in a strict 1v1 of all the ranged heroes, Gul'dan and Orphea fit that offlane role the best. If you were looking to draft something a little bit weird and you wanted a ranged hero to be an offlane, Gul'dan and Orphea do it best because they have a ton of wave clear, but they also have a ton of self-sustain. So pretty much all of the tier 1 offlaners that we'll get to later on would have a very, very bad time laning against something like an Orphea. So in a map where, like Dragonshire, in a map where that's really going to matter a lot and it is an isolated 1v1, something like an Orphea can be quite strong as an offlaner, even though you don't see it very often.
And when you look at this Gul'dan, you're not picking Gul'dan for Horrify at 10, right? You're looking for that Rain of Destruction for the proper siege value, correct?
Oh, absolutely. You've got the meatballs ready as soon as the enemy offlaner leaves to soak a wave. He soaks one wave, and you've got the power of 3 Hyperions coming into his base with those meatballs. So, sort of joking, but I do actually think the meatballs are underrated on Gul'dan right now.
I absolutely agree. No, I'd actually love to see Rain of Destruction more often, and it is a good siege tool. But either way, moving up further onto our tier list here for our offlane, we're going to be looking at tier 2, and it's going to be ETC, Deathwing, Imperius, Abathur, the Lost Vikings, Samuro, Rhaegar, and Falstad. There's some interesting ones in here, Justing, specifically that Rhaegar kind of catches my eye, but could you break down why some of these are in tier 2 and maybe why some of them aren't in tier 1, like an Abathur or a Lost Vikings?
Yeah, so Rhaegar, like you had touched on, Rhaegar is kind of the premier version of having your support be in the offlane. How I'd mentioned in tier 4, Brightwing and Oriole, if you're trying to draft a double support composition and your comp is a little bit weird where you need to put a support in the offlane, Rhaegar can do that quite well. He really has no problem clearing waves with the totem, with the lightning shield on it, and he's just really safe. He's got dog form to run away if he gets ganked, so Rhaegar just does that really well as a support, so that's more just to make your draft flexible if you want to, and he'll hold his ground just fine against the offlaners that you traditionally see. Things like the ETC, Deathwing, and Imperius are very similar to the tier 1 heroes in that they're just bruisers. You're going to have ETC with Stage Dive at level 10, which on some maps is extremely valuable. The main issue with ETC is that his early game wave clear is quite bad. You need level 7 before you really start getting any wave clear. So a team might try to punish you before then, but once you are level 10, you kind of provide, I would say, more utility than most of the offlaners. Once you hit level 10, you are able to split push and have that stage dive whenever any fights break out for your 4-man. Deathwing is more of a situational pick based on the rest of the team comp. He does really well in pretty much all of the 1v1s in the offlane. Just breathing on the wave clears it quite easily, and you have that self-sustain with whatever level 1 you choose to go. And Imperius actually wins most of the 1v1s, but his wave clear doesn't really kick in again like ETC until level 7. But his main specialty is that he has that percent damage level 1. So depending on what you're up against, and depending on, like, if let's say you kind of messed up your draft a little bit and you didn't have any kind of percent damage and a Diablo came out, being able to pick up an Imperius, which is a good counter to Diablo as a late pick, and just throw that into your offlane kind of makes up for that lack of damage that you would need. So Yeah, they're all sort of just situational picks that can be better than the tier 1 picks that we'll get into in a little bit. And then Lost Vikings, Abathur, and Samuro are heroes that if you build your comp around them, they can fill that offlane role and they can do it better than a traditional offlaner can. You just need to have a draft built around it. So like Samuro, for example, with Abathur, you say that that's your offlane and suddenly nothing can really step into that, especially once you get into level 16, level 20. It can kind of just take over the game, which we've seen a lot on maps like Dragonshire. And then Falstad, he's not normally the only offlaner. Normally you kind of 2v1 the offlane with a Falstad, but you do have the option to just let him be in that solo lane and have that global from level 1, have the wave clear from level 1. It's somewhat similar to like an ETC in the sense that you've got that global, but you've got the power really early in the game. You don't have to wait until level 7 for that to come online. And yeah, so the tier 2 heroes can be better than the tier 1s, but it's a lot more situational. But there are situations where they are just strictly better.
And I do agree, like, I love the Falstad also with his just variety at level 1. I mean, we don't see Dishonorable Discharge. I actually just casted a game recently of one, and they almost finished all 75 stacks almost in 30 minutes of a game, but you have that scaling from the level 1 if you go into Frequent Flyer, as well as the Boomerang up against a solo laner, so I absolutely agree. I've been loving playing Falstad in the solo lane. He's teetering on that tier 1 for me a little bit in some of those situations, especially with Gust being such a great control factor for the Falstad, but as I had mentioned, we've got tier 1s left to go for our offlane tier list here, and Justing, you know, some people might get a little upset at that the last one here, but for anyone wondering, we've got Blaze, Dahaka, Hogger, Joanna, Leoric, Yrel, and making his reprisal, Stukov in tier 1 for offlane. And I have to immediately ask you, why Stukov is in tier 1 as an offlaner, as well as a tier 1 tank?
Stukov, the man of the hour, he just does it all. Stukov is kind of ridiculous with his build paths. You've got the low blow build, you've got the reactive ballista spores at level 1, you've got the active, which makes it so that you're basically not a target, which is what enabled him to be a tank, and the E, the puddle, being able to clear waves so easily and so safely is what also makes him an excellent offlaner, because the enemy offlane doesn't really get to interact with that. You can't really stop him from just putting the puddle down on the minion wave from the range that he gets to do it from. He has a ton of self-sustain, and if you're only using your active with your D, or your trait on yourself, it's very easy to keep yourself sustained. None of the other offlaners in tier 1 can really do damage to you. So he actually, and his auto attacks do a ton of damage, so when you do go in for those short trades when the enemy's trying to clear the wave, he outtrades pretty much all the offlaners. So Stukov, while I did put him in S tier for tanks, is also an S tier offlaner. Stukov is kind of a problem, in my opinion, if you are looking at the game from a draft perspective. He can kind of do every role at a premier level. Also at level 10, it's very unfun if you try to play offlane into him and you're not a Leoric or a Johanna with that unstoppable. If as soon as you try to clear the wave, you get shoved immediately and you actually lose priority to the Stukov. So that's why Stukov's there.
You know what we're going to have to do one time? We're going to have to try an off-lane or a main tank Stukov with an Abathur with the Adrenal Overload to get you the faster auto attacks or something like that. Or maybe even like a Lieutenant Morales as well with Stim. There's some very interesting ideas we can bring to the table with the Stukov. But of course, I'm sure people are wondering, you know, about the Blaze, Dahaka, Hogger, Joanna, Leoric, and Yrel. What makes them this tier 1? What makes them so much better than a Deathwing or Imperious, etc. below?
So all of them have self-sustain, with the exception of Johanna in the early game. They all have self-sustain from level 1, besides Johanna. Johanna has her shield, which is basically just as good as self-sustain because you activate it in the moments where you're actually going to be in danger while you're clearing the wave. They're all extremely safe. It's nearly impossible to gank any of them. Blaze has jet propulsion, Dahaka has his E, he can burrow away, Hogger can turn into a tornado and just roll away with unstoppable, Johanna can pop her unstoppable and run away, Leoric can press E, get unstoppable and run away, and Yrel can just jump away if she wants to. So they're all pretty much ungankable in the offlane. They all have a ton of wave clear as well. Dahaka being the only one who doesn't really have wave clear from level 1 out of these tier 1 heroes. He's pretty much the only one who doesn't have enough wave clear to just one-shot the minion wave very quickly and leave, but he makes up for that by having the global. So then the rest of them all clear the wave really well. They all have a ton of self-sustain. They all brawl extremely well in the early game. They all have a ton of point control once you get into team fights, and just a ton of utility once you get into team fights. Like a Blaze, for example, just has so much utility. He has damage reduction on his level 4 if he chooses to go it. He has one of the highest base HPs in the entire game. Bunker is just ridiculous for saving your team in a team fight. His E is incredible follow-up for pretty much any tank CC. You have damage reduction from his level 7 options, and they all kind of have this similar theme of they're just juggernauts walking around. I think the tier 1 offlanes in general are some of the strongest heroes in the entire game, where if you were looking to pick more than one of any role, this would be, I'd say the offlanes and the supports right now are kind of the strongest heroes overall. And all these tier 1 heroes, you can pretty much first pick any of them and have no problem feeling like you're going to get countered in the draft, because they all just do everything that they need to do extremely well.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Another fantastic tier list brought to you by Justing and I. And of course, Justing, much like on the tank tier list, do you have any words of wisdom to any of the offlane mains or anyone who's trying to get better at their offlaning? Is it pick a blaze, win the game? Is it positioning? Is it not extending too far out in the lane?
It is pick a blaze, win the game. The tier 1 offlanes are kind of ridiculous right now. I think they're all a little bit too strong. Definitely look to get just get comfortable with the tier 1 heroes. They're really, really strong. The main thing in a competitive sense in team fights, especially with offlane, is you need to be aware of what your tank is doing. Typically, the tank and the offlane need to be doing sort of different things. Normally you have one of them that is kind of playing to peel and protect the team, and the other one that is sort of looking for flanks or looking for engages. So kind of paying attention to where your tank player is playing to either follow up on his CC or to peel your backline when your tank goes in is really important. Just being really aware of where your tank is as the offlane. And also just kind of making sure that you're with the team when you need to be. That's really the most important thing, is being in the right place at the right time as the offlane and trying to just sneak minions whenever you can. But remember that being with your team when a team fight might happen is going to be more valuable than catching a minion wave if it means that your team's in a 4v5.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. You've got everything you need to know about every single offlane in Heroes of the Storm. If you think Justing and I missed any offlaners, or if we think that the list is wrong, please leave a comment below, like the video, and be sure to check out other videos that Justing and I have done in the past, just like this tank video right here. Click it. Do it.